I actually started writing some of these stories years ago when I first became a hospice nurse, and I had already got to this place of believing in something after this world. Deathbed visions are when people are close to the end of their life and they have visions of deceased loved ones or even pets. Children more often see pets than they do people. One of my patients was looking up at the corner of the room and he was crying and he was yelling, Ingrid, Ingrid, she's right there. I see her. And I said, is she coming to get you? And he said, yes. And about 4 out of 10 dying people, when they are kind of close to the end of their life, they have a burst of energy. Something else that we see people do is called travel language. And that is when they will start talking about needing to go somewhere. And then there's also the phenomena of people waiting for somebody to arrive or to hear something from somebody or for people to leave the room. And then they die when everybody has left the room. If you like the afterlife stories, I've got a couple. My dad did come to me after he died.
The A.J. Parr Spiritual Journalist Podcast.
I'm here with Penny Smith. She's better known as Hospice Nurse Penny, and she has been a certified hospice nurse for almost 20 years now. Hello, Penny. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm interested in talking about deathbed experiences. These involve several different types, like afterlife visions, terminal lucidity, even afterlife communication.
Deathbed visions are when people are close to the end of their life and they have visions of deceased loved ones or even pets. It can happen weeks before their death. They can be very clear about what they're seeing, then tell us what they're seeing. Um, Sometimes as they get closer to death, we are no longer able to communicate with them. They can't communicate with us, but we still believe that they're having them because one of the other things that people who are dying will do often is to like reach up into the air or, reach up to the corner of the room, which is sometimes where they say they see these visions. So it's very common to see people who are either saying that they're seeing these things or they're indicating by their movement that they are probably seeing these things. They'll point up and mutter words, mutter names. So that's very common. One of my patients was in a room next to the hospice nurse's station, and I was charting and I heard him yelling. And I went into the room and he was looking up at the corner of the room and he was crying. He had tears just pouring down his face. And he was reaching up to the corner of the room and he was yelling, Ingrid, Ingrid. I knew his wife had died a year before him. And I asked him, is that your wife? And he said, yes, yes. And I see her. She's right there. I see her. And I said, is she coming to get you? And he said, yes, yes, but not today, tomorrow. And I thought, well, that's really specific. And he didn't die the next day. It took him a couple of days to die. And when the caregiver who had cared for Ingrid when she died and for my patient while he was sick in the last year of his life, when she came to pick up his belongings, I told her the story. And she said, well, it was always like Ingrid to be late.
Any other?
I've lots of them. Yeah. So we had a patient who her daughter put the call light on and asked me to come in and give her some medication. She said she's hallucinating. And so I stood there for a minute and I watched and I could see her pointing up at the ceiling, pointing up like this, pointing and saying names. And I heard her and said a name and I said, who's I don't remember what the name was, like who's Kathy? I said, who's Kathy to the daughter? And she goes, oh my gosh, that's my aunt. That's her sister. She's dead. And I said, really? And she goes, yeah. And then I see her going, Mama, Daddy. And I said, oh, she's deathbed visioning. She's seeing people who have died before her. And this is common. And clearly, it's not stressing her out, it's bringing her comfort. So we don't want to upset her. It's making her happy. It's bringing her peace at the end of her life. Very good friend of mine, a colleague of mine, is a pediatric hospice nurse, and she told me about her patient who saw her grandfather when she was dying. So there's a doctor that has done studies on deathbed visions, and he says that, I mean, he's interviewed like hundreds of people who were dying, including children. And he says children more often see pets than they do people because a lot of the times there haven't been any people in their life who has died before them, but they see animals more often. So I think that's kind of interesting, and it does ring true. Um, Something that I find kind of interesting also is that I've had people say to me that somebody is visioning people that are still alive. And what does that mean? Well, I don't know that when we're deathbed visioning, that we're only going to see people who we were related to, who we knew when they were alive. And I wonder if you see people who you were related to who you didn't know, who died, maybe your great grandmother or great great grandmother that you never knew, who died. Um, and then you're seeing people that you know who look like that person. So, like, for example, my daughter is the spitting image of my grandmother when my grandmother was my daughter's age. Like, it's like she's her clone. And I could see where if I was on my deathbed, I might be seeing my grandmother and thinking that my daughter's in the room. Like, I'm seeing Mia, but Mia's not here and Mia's alive. So why am I seeing her? It's because she looks like my grandmother who I'm seeing. So does that make sense? Like they think they're seeing people who are alive, but they're actually visioning these people who died before that they maybe didn't know, who looks like somebody who's still alive. And that's my own personal theory as far as that goes. And then terminal lucidity, that's another one you mentioned, is very common as well. That can happen in about 4 out of 10 dying people. And that's really when they are kind of close to the end of their life. And then they have a burst of energy and they wake up and they want to visit, they want to eat a meal. Somebody who has dementia might all of a sudden become something very else that we clear see people and do is remember called travel everybody language, and have that is a when they will start talking conversation with about needing to people. go somewhere. So that's Need to another go on a one that's trip. pretty I want to pretty go common at the end of home life when they're already in their house. I need to pack. I need to get out of here. I'm boarding the train. I'm driving the truck. Is another common occurrence that can happen when people are dying. Shared death experiences is something I had not really ever heard about much until I got onto social media, and then I realized that I had one with my dad when my dad died, that he was in the hospital and I was at home, at his home, and I was laying in the hospital bed that was down in the basement, not basement, but family room in the lower level of the house. He had been on home health, and so he had a hospital bed in their home. And my dad collected lots of things, and one of the things that he collected was hats. And I was laying in this hospital bed, and I looked up at this beam on the ceiling above me, and I saw all these hats hanging up there. And I was just like, wow, look at all those hats hanging up there. And I just couldn't stop focusing on how many hats were hanging up there. I was just really perseverating on that, like, wow, look at those hats. There are so many hats hanging up there. And then the phone rang, and the nurse called and said, I think you need to come now. And so I got my brother who was there. We went upstairs, grabbed my mom, and said, we got to go to the hospital. I didn't even ask her what's going on. I just got everybody and let's go. On the way to the hospital, she called again. And this time she called my brother's phone and he was driving. So I answered the phone and she said, um, is this, I'm calling for Brad. And I said, well, this is Penny. I'm his sister. You just called me a little while ago. She goes, yeah, your dad just died. And I said, oh, okay. So we went to the hospital and she knew I was a hospice nurse. And so she asked me, did I want to know how it happened? And I said, yeah. And she said, well, I went into his room and he was having some trouble breathing. So I gave him a little bit of morphine. And he said, And then he said, I'm about ready to hang it up. And she went back and got some lorazepam. And when she came back to him, he was taking his final breaths. And so I knew that at the time that he was telling the nurse, I'm about ready to hang it up, is when I was laying in that bed, looking at those hats hanging above the bed and thinking, look at all those hats hanging up there. And it was just like my dad to say something like that too. So that's what I consider that was a shared death experience. I've never had anything else like that. And I know that other people will have experiences that they consider like they're even more profound, like they're seeing what the dying person is seeing. And I've never had anything like that. And a lot of times people will say to me, well, did any of your patients ever come to you after they died? And I say, well, no, but why would they? I was just a nurse who took care of them at their end of their life. I'm not their family, I'm not their friends. Why would they visit me? So I've never really had anybody come to me after they died, except my dad. My dad did come to me after he died. But I've got some really good afterlife. Like if you like the afterlife stories, I've got a couple. Like I said, my patients never came to me. My dad did. So probably about 3 weeks after my dad died, um, I was sleeping and my dad came to me and he was like bright orange light and warm, really warm. Like I could feel him and just energy, just exuding energy. And it was his voice. And he said, um, it's time to go. And I said, okay. And then I said, oh, but I'm going to have to say goodbye to the kids. They're really going to miss me. And he said, no, it's not time for you to go. It's time for me to go. And I said, oh, okay. Well, I love you. And he goes, I love you. And I started crying. And he said, I love you, honey. I love you, honey. And I said, I love you. And I woke up. I hate to say woke up because it makes it sound like I was dreaming. And it definitely was not like a dream. This was really real what happened to me. But I woke up and my husband had his arms around me and I'm still crying and I'm saying, I love you, I love you. And my husband is saying, I love you, honey, I love you. And I thought, that's strange because my dad never called me honey and my husband has never called me honey. Neither one of them have ever called me honey. So I thought, well, that's strange. And then he said, um, you were talking to your dad. And I said, no, my dad was talking to me. I was answering him. So that was my experience that really like sealed the deal for me. I had been a hospice nurse for 5 years when that happened, and I had already got to this place of believing in something after this world. I never was raised with religion or faith, and so I don't believe in heaven or hell. Still don't, never did. And so I really had a lot of anxiety about what happens after we die. But working in hospice and seeing deathbed visions made me think, yeah, there really is something after this. And for me, that was like that was it. That was the clincher. But then it got even better because my sister and my mom were like, why you? Why did he come to you and why not us? And my brother's an atheist, so he didn't even ask because he doesn't believe in anything like that. And I said, well, it's because I feel like I'm more open to it because of my work with the dying. I'm connected to death. Well, a few years later, actually, it wasn't even a few years later, it's probably a year later. My sister was going through some really hard times with her only daughter, and she was addicted to meth and heroin. And my sister was struggling so much because there were things that she needed to do, like evict her from the house that she had bought for her to rent, and cut her cell phone off that she was paying for. And the worst thing was that she needed to get custody, emergency custody of her 4-year-old granddaughter because it was really bad. And so she was going through such a hard time. And her husband taught her how to meditate. And she said she was meditating and she sees a bench, and my dad is sitting on the bench, and there's a dark figure sitting next to him. And she is asking my dad, what do I do? And he says, Laura, you know what to do. You just need to do it. And it was just a turning point for her because she all of a sudden had the strength. She knew what to do. She just couldn't do it until my dad said that to her. And so she started down this pathway of being able to evict her daughter from the house and get emergency custody of her granddaughter. And she said each time that she would meditate, the figure of my dad would get like more transparent, but the dark figure remained until finally at one point the dark figure was all that was left and my dad was gone. And it was like my dad was there for her when she needed him to be there. And then he was gone when she had everything taken care of. And also want to say my niece is clean and sober now, and it's been 9 years, and she's wonderful, and everything is great. Um, but then my mom did not have her experience until years later, and she said to me, "I keep having these wisps." And I said, "What do you mean wisps? What's a wisp?" And she said, "I don't know, like a little wisp." And then I hear dad's voice and he says something like, "Be careful." And she'll be like weed eating or something in the yard. And he'll go, "Be careful now." And so I asked her, "Well, what do you think about that?" She goes, "Well, I don't know. I don't believe in the afterlife." And I was like, "Okay." So I let it go and I didn't say anything for a long time. And then a while later, I asked her, "Are you still having those wisps?" "Well, yeah, but not as much as I used to." And I said, "Oh, and what do you think they are?" And she goes, "Well, I don't believe in an afterlife, if that's what you're asking." And I said, "Okay, but what do you think they are?" She goes, "Well," and I go, "Do you think they're dead?" And she goes, "Well, yeah, I think they're dead." And I said, "Well, then I guess you believe in an afterlife, don't you?" And then my brother to this day has never had anything that he's told us about. But again, I really believe you have to be open to these experiences to experience them. I think if you don't believe, then you're not going to have those types of experiences. As far as people, how do they deal with the fact that they're going to die? People are always going to be scared and sad when they're first told that they're dying. Everybody is. It's shocking to find that out. Even somebody like me who believes in death positivity and knows we're all going to die, and I accept that. If I was dying and somebody said you're dying, I'd be sad and like probably a little bit scared. Um, but by the time they get to the end of life, they are usually at a place of acceptance. And I have rarely seen anybody who did not have a peaceful death at the end. Now, sometimes people have terminal agitation that is caused by existential suffering, and we do have to sedate them until their death, and they have a peaceful death. But, most of the time people do get to a place of acceptance of death before they die. And really, you have to be there before you can have a peaceful death, because if you don't, you won't. And that is when we get that terminal agitation. Or I did have one patient who, at the very end, was really struggling, really scared. And at the moment of death, he was finally peaceful. He finally looked up at the ceiling and just peace washed over his face. And then he was finally peaceful. There are little things that come out that let you know that there are things that they wish they would have done that they didn't do. Most people will go through a dying process. Those who die a natural death will go through a dying process. Sometimes people will die suddenly when they're on hospice, but they don't die like they do on TV. They don't say famous last words or profound last things and then close their eyes and die. That's not how it happens. There's a progression of signs and symptoms that happens, starting with the earlier signs, which are sleeping more, eating less, becoming a little more withdrawn from people around them. And then there are physical changes that start to happen, such as their circulation is changing. So they might have color changes in their feet and their hands, and continuing this like more and more of the sleeping, less and less of the eating, having difficulty swallowing. Then they have these other things that we see, like the reaching in the air or picking at their clothes or the travel language or deathbed visions. Those types of things are usually happening in a period that we call transitioning. And this is when people usually have like weeks left, weeks of life left, weeks to days. As they get closer to the end, they are going to be more and more unresponsive. And when they're awake, oftentimes it seems like they're not really present. They're not really here. It's almost like they're back and forth between here and something else. And some people will say like the veil is being lifted, and they're kind of experiencing the other world or whatever is beyond this. And so we see this confusion, restlessness is really normal. As they, really get into their final hours, they're usually completely unresponsive. They're not going to respond to anything at all. And they're going to almost always have their eyes open or partially open. The mouth will be hanging open. The neck can be hyperextended at times. Breathing patterns really change. They might breathe really fast, really slow, really shallow, really deep, long periods of no breath at all. It changes all over the place. People can have what is known as a death rattle. So because they're not able to swallow anymore, they're not swallowing their saliva. And so that builds up in the airway and it'll start making this gurgling or rattling noise. That usually indicates that a person is within days of the end of their life. Many, many people will die within about 48 hours of developing a death rattle. They might get a fever. They may get really sweaty and clammy. And eventually they just stop breathing and they die. That period of time, that unresponsiveness can last for minutes, hours, days, and sometimes a week or even a couple of weeks. Um, so yeah, it can last a while, and we don't know why. Like we don't know why people live that long. Somebody once said that there's the spiritual side of dying, the spiritual and emotional side of dying, and the physical side of dying, and both have to meet before death can occur. So somebody could be really physically ready, but not spiritually or emotionally ready. And somebody could be really spiritually and emotionally ready and not physically ready. And those people are going to tend to linger a little bit. And then there's also the phenomena of people waiting for somebody to arrive or to hear something from somebody or for people to leave the room. And then they die when everybody has left the room. It changed me in so many ways. For one thing, like I said, I had no religious belief or faith, and I do have a faith now in an afterlife. I had death anxiety really bad before I went into hospice, and I don't anymore. I accept that I'm going to die, and that's the key. And I do believe in an afterlife. I don't know what it is. None of us do. We can believe we know what it is, but we don't. We'll know when we die, or we won't if there's nothing. Um, and just, being able to do this work, it's never been anything that I thought of as hard or sad. It's a gift. It's sacred. Um, I've been blessed to be able to not only have had the opportunity to do it, but to have the wherewithal, the strength, the compassion to be able to do it. Not everyone can do it, and I'm just really grateful that I've been able to do it. It makes me feel good to be able to help people at the end of their life and to help their family not to be afraid of what's unfolding. It's really, really rewarding. I'm not an angel. I'm just a person. I have a past. I have a reckless past. And I found redemption through being a hospice nurse, but I'm not an angel because of my chosen profession. I'm just a person who is gratefully able to do this work. I was 40 years old when I went to nursing school, and I was going to nursing school because my second husband and I were getting divorced, and I had been a stay-at-home mom for 10 years, homeschooling my kids, and didn't really have a career. I had been a bartender before I met my husband, so I just really had no career to fall back on. And these days, you can't be a single family income. You just can't do that. I knew I wasn't going to be able to survive without having some kind of career, and decided to be a nurse. And his stepmother had died on hospice a year before um, I made the decision to be a nurse. And I was just really amazed by those nurses. I just really could see how sacred the work was that they were doing. And I had had this, like I said, reckless past. And I felt like I wanted to do something that would, redeem me a little bit in the universe and make me feel like I was giving back when I had spent many years taking. I just wanted to give back. And so I thought that's what I want to do. That's the path that I want to be on. And At first, I was a licensed practical nurse, and I did not think that licensed practical nurses could be hospice nurses. I thought you had to be a registered nurse. So I went to work in a clinic for a year, and my goal was to eventually go back to school and become an RN so I could work in hospice. So after a year, I decided that in anticipation of moving in that direction, I would go work at a hospital and get some clinical skills. And I went to the hospital and I had started dating somebody who's my current husband now. And there was a hospice care center that was going to be opening in his neighborhood. And I would go home and I would say to him, I am going to work at that care center someday. I'm going to be an RN and I'm going to work at that care center. And I worked at the hospital for 3 months and then I got laid off. And I thought, you know what? I don't know where I got the idea that you can't be an LPN and work in hospice, but I'm going to go to that care center and I'm going to see if that's true. And they still had one LPN position available and they hired me. And so from then on, that's what I ended up doing. And I did become an RN, eventually got my bachelor's degree too. And I've pretty much just done hospice the whole way ever since then. During the shutdown, the pandemic shutdown, I found my way to TikTok and I was no longer doing patient care. I'm a hospice quality nurse now. So I do quality assurance for a hospice agency. I'm close to retiring and I work from home 3 days a week. So it's wonderful. But I found TikTok and my husband worked nights and I worked days and I was bored. I couldn't go to the Y and work out anymore and I couldn't do anything. And so I found TikTok and I at first was just trying to learn how to shuffle dance and making some silly little trends, but back then it was really a kids app and I'm an old lady and so nothing ever got any views or anything. And then one day for some reason I decided to make a video about a hospice patient that died and it went viral and all of a sudden I had like 10,000 followers in a couple of days. And I've always been passionate about educating on hospice and normalizing death and dying because I think it makes the dying experience better for everyone if they know what to expect and they're not afraid of it. And I realized that people were interested in knowing about this, especially because during the pandemic, that's all we heard about was how many people were dying. People were dying all over the place, and a lot of people were all of a sudden more curious to know about death. And I had the information, so I started making videos. I told a story about when I was first a new hospice nurse and I was working in the hospice care center. And for those who don't know, hospice care center is where people usually go to have their symptoms managed that can't be managed at home. And they almost always will die in the care center. So there was a patient who she was an elderly lady and her daughter was a nun. And she had a lot of nun visitors that were coming to see her. And one Sunday evening, the last visitor came out of the room. It was a nun. She came to the desk, to the nurse's station, which was just right adjacent from the room. And she said, "Oh, she's gone." And I said, "Oh," and I stood up and I grabbed my stethoscope. And she said, "No, no, no. She's still here doing the work of dying, but her spirit has left. You can see it in her eyes." So I went into the room and I looked, and in fact, I could see that this woman had this glazed over appearance in her eyes. It was truly like the lights are on, but nobody's home. She wasn't focused on anything. And I, at that moment, realized that people who are dying can possibly exit their body before their body is done doing the work. And I think at the end of the video, I said, they say that the eyes are the window to the soul. And I believe that now because when the soul leaves, you can see it in their eyes.
You recently published your book, Influencing Death, Reframing Dying for Better Living. So what made you write that book and what would people interested in reading it find?
Well, I actually started writing some of these stories years ago when I first became a hospice nurse. And I've just always been a creative writer. And the experiences were something that I always wanted to remember. And so I started writing them down. And before I went on TikTok, Amazon had this website that you could go on to. And it was like a formatting thing that would format screenplays, and they would choose screenplays from amateur writers. And I was so disgusted with the portrayal of death and dying on TV. It was so unrealistic. And I thought, there's nothing out on TV about hospice nurses. So I actually started writing this screenplay. And then Amazon got rid of the program. And I was like, well, okay, so much for that. So I shelved it again. And then I got on TikTok and started telling some of these stories and doing education. And people kept telling me, you should write a book. And once I got a few 100,000 followers under my belt, I thought maybe I should write a book. And I wanted it to be, I didn't want it to be just a hospice death and dying book information text. I wanted it to be more engaging than that. And what I realized through my TikTok is that people liked not only hearing about the patients that I cared for, but they liked hearing about why I cared for them, why I chose hospice, who I am as a person, what led me down that pathway. And so I decided that I really wanted this book to be a memoir. And so it is about death, and it's also about life. It's about my life and why I like the road that I was on that led me to be a hospice nurse, how it is that I became a hospice nurse, and the patients that I cared for and the lessons that I learned while I was caring for them, as well as education about death and dying. So it's educational, but it's also entertaining, which has been my whole social media platform shtick, if you will. It's all about entertaining and educating at the same time, because I think a lot of people find that the subject of death is dark, and I like to make it more palatable by lightening it up with humor and dancing and personality. And so I wanted my book to reflect what my social media platform is. So I always say, if you like my social media, you will love my book, because it really is me in that book, just like I am on social media.
In your book, you mentioned Lorraine and Brandon, and you tell us interesting story. Can you tell us more or less what this is about?
Yeah, Brandon was a very young man. He was in his early 20s, and his mom was a single parent, had been a single parent. His dad had died when he was a baby. Actually, before he was born, his dad died while she was pregnant. And Lorraine was really scared and really struggling. And when I went to the house, she was playing like harp music or some kind of classical music, which I thought was really odd because he was a young man. And she was really distressed and wanted to know what was going on. You know, that he had just come on hospice. Nobody had really been straight with her about what was happening. She said they said he has 6 months to live, and I said, well, 6 months or less, you know, or less is important because he looks like he could die soon. And so I taught her like how to do some care with him. And then I was leaving, I said to her, was that the kind of music that he would have liked? And she wasn't she was like, "Oh, I don't know." And I said, "You might want to try putting something else on or something like that," I said to her. And when I came back, so she called me later in the day and said, things have changed. I don't know what's happening. I'm so scared. I don't know what to do. And so I said, okay, well, I can come there and see what's going on. And I got there, but when I got up to the door, there was this loud music playing, like blasting rap music with all kinds of swear words in it. And I walked in and I was like, wow, the tempo sure has changed. And she said, yeah, I realized that he would probably like this music. And then she said, of course, it makes me want to die to have to listen to it. And then she kind of like half jokingly said that. And then she kind of started crying and said, I'm sorry, am I an awful person for saying that? And I was like, no, it's okay to say that. You know, we use humor for coping all the time. But then I said, she's like, I don't know what to do. And I said, well, you know, tell him what he means to you. Sometimes there comes a point when there's nothing left to do and you just need to be with a person when they're dying. And I just said, well, tell him what he means to you. And she said, Brandon, you know, when that doctor handed me you and you were a tiny little baby, and I thought, how are we going to do this now that your dad's dead? And I looked into your face and I saw him and I realized we were going to be okay. You know, she said this really beautiful thing to him, and then he took his last breath and he died. And it was just really beautiful.
Your book was rejected by several publishers before you actually did publish it. So, can you tell me that
Yeah.
story? Was it hard to publish this book about death?
It was. So there are other hospice social media influencers. And I was the first one to really educate about death and dying, but the other ones became more popular, maybe because they're younger than me, maybe because I'm not for everybody. You know, I'm like the only one who really does the dancing and the dark humor stuff and pretending I'm dead and all that stuff. So I'm not for everybody, and that's okay. But so they got book deals, and the publishers were rejecting me, saying there's already hospice nurses that are writing books right now. We're not interested. And which I say, well, if you've read a book by a hospice nurse, you've read a book by a hospice nurse. That, you know, we're all different. Our books are different. And then I did get an offer from a traditional publisher, but they didn't want me to write a memoir. They wanted me to write a more of a this is all about death and dying book, and that's not what I wrote. And I just I'm going to compare myself to Taylor Swift and say, I know my audience. I know what they want. And I wanted to write the book I wanted to write. And it had pretty much already written at this point. And so I went through a hybrid publisher, and I paid a publisher who, you know, basically hired the editorial at or the developmental editor and the copy editor. Like they did all this work for me. I did not have the knowledge to do this work on my own. And so I just decided that I would take the money that I earned on TikTok and put it into publishing the book. And then that's how it came to be.
Great. How's it doing? It was released recently, right?
Yeah, so it was released 10 days ago, and I've sold, well, last week I heard that I had sold um, more than 6,000 copies of the hardcover and paperback, which is phenomenal for a new author. New authors typically only sell 1 to 200 books in the first year. So it's done really well. And that doesn't include like audiobooks and ebooks. And it's ranking on Amazon. It's been #1 overall for palliative care, #1 for biographies by medical professionals. It's been a #1 new release for love and loss, death and grief. It was #20 new release for memoir, which is a very competitive category. So yeah, it's done really, really well. I'm very, very happy with how it's done. But you know, where the rubber meets the road is, do people like it? So that's all based on sales, and that's fantastic that people want to read what I have to write. But what matters to me is that it's helpful to people and that people like it.
I would like to know, what would you tell someone who is about to die, facing death, or who recently lost a loved one? What is your message?
So people often want to know what to do when their person who just found out they're going on hospice is sad about it. And so what I tell those people is that's okay. It's normal. It's normal to be sad. It's normal to be fearful. People need to work through what is unfolding for them. They need to process, they need to grieve the end of their life that they are anticipating. So that's what I tell somebody when they want to know. Like, but otherwise, I don't necessarily need to say anything unless they're asking me the questions. Sometimes we're afraid to not speak. We think we have to say something to people, and it's okay to not say anything and just to be present with somebody and hold space with them.
You're in TikTok, you're also in Facebook, you're also in Instagram. Are there any other social medias in which you are in?
Yeah, I'm on YouTube also, and I'm
Okay, I
on
can see that you have a
Substack.
YouTube
Yeah, I have a
award.
YouTube channel. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, my what is
Yeah,
it?
I can see that.
Yeah.
How many subscribers do you have? That means that you must have over 1,000,
Well,
100,000.
yeah, I have 275,000 on YouTube.
Okay.
Yeah, I have over 2 million across all my platforms. I'm Hospice Nurse Penny on all of my platforms. I have a website, hospicenursepenny.com. There are links to buy my book there, but you can also find it. The audio version, which I narrated, is on Audible or any of the audiobooks, any place you can buy a book online. Same with the regular books, the ebook. They're on Barnes and Noble, Amazon, Tertulia, anywhere you can buy books online. And if you want to buy from a local bookstore, it should be in their catalog and they can order it for you.
Is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I would just say that it's really important that we all get in the conversation when it comes to death and dying, because it will absolutely happen to every single one of us. We cannot avoid that. And the best way to have a good death is to accept that you are going to die.
This has been the A.J. Parr Spiritual Journalist Podcast. Please like, share, and subscribe.